Hello and welcome to India's World. According to Western media reports, there is evidence that Russia is intensifying its military involvement in Syria. US and NATO officials have expressed concern that a new and dramatic Russian military buildup in Syria could lead to an escalation of the civil war in that country. However, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has denied these allegations and claimed that Russia was not boosting its military presence in Syria. He has insisted that Russia was sticking to existing commitments and not taking any additional steps. To discuss Russia's military engagement with Syria and the prospect of this relationship expanding in the coming days and months, we have with us three distinguished experts. We have with us Ambassador Kanwal Sibal, former Foreign Secretary of India, one of India's most prominent diplomats. He's been Ambassador to Turkey, Egypt, France and Russia. Professor A.K. Ramakrishnan, he's Professor at the Center for West Asian Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University. My old friend Dr. Weil Awwad, he's the South Asia Bureau Chief of SANA, Syrian Arab News Agency in New Delhi. I welcome you gentlemen to this discussion. Ambassador Sibal, let me begin with you. Why is there a sudden hyped up concern about Russian military involvement in Syria? What is the new development and how credible are the conclusions that are drawn from this?
Well, you know, there is a media and information war and a psychological war that is being carried on now for years. And most recently it has been intensified against Russia. And then the Western media has outlets in the rest of the world. And whatever they put out through intelligence agencies, planted reports, then gets a lot of echo across the globe. And therefore a picture gets built up that Russia is being irresponsible, Russia is aggravating things, it is intervening military or intends to step up its military involvement and the repercussions of that and all the other things that are said. And actually what the Americans or the Europeans and others are doing is suppressed. The fact of the matter is that Syria has been destabilized because of Western policies. It's the continuum of what happened in Iraq, Libya, and then on to Syria. They simply can't stand the idea that somehow Assad should stay on in power because there'll be a huge diplomatic defeat for them because they had already announced 2-3 years ago that Assad has to go. Assad is a non-entity. They will not accept him as president. They have actually special forces on the ground. They have transferred a lot of weapons directly and indirectly, including from Libya to the extremists and the Islamists, and they have a hand in the creation of the Islamic State. So nobody talks about that. And simply because Russia is sticking to its commitments, and let me just add, and I'll finish here, that the legitimate government of Syria is the Assad government, and Russia has every right to support this government. There are no UN sanctions against Syria. So on what basis of international law can the West actually object to what Russia is doing? And finally, Russia played a big role in trying to prevent a conflagration in Syria because they cooperated in getting all the chemical weapons out of Syria. So Russia's role has been, to my mind, rather responsible. Okay, so now, but the Western fear, Professor Ramakrishnan, is that by supplying additional equipment, including portable air defense systems, they say, Russia is preparing for air combat operations in Syria. Now, how credible is that conclusion?
The Russian position is that, as you have pointed out initially, it's the continuing military cooperation with Syria. And Russian experts are there, Russian technicians are on the ground, and Russia is not denying any of these things. Any improvement on the existing facilities and equipment is part and parcel of the long-standing relationship between Syria and Russia.
So nothing new is happening?
It's just a continuation of a policy, and I think there is an increased activity because of the instability in the country and in the region. Okay. And also the continuing tension between NATO and Russia on Ukraine and other kinds of things. And what Lavrov was saying was that the channels of communication between Russia and NATO should be opened so that the forthcoming exhibition of the naval exercises, etc., in the Eastern Mediterranean should not be taken otherwise by the Western countries, because that may escalate the situation. So there is increased activity, no doubt about it. But the Russians and the Syrians feel that this is part and parcel of the ongoing commitment.
Okay. Dr. Awwad, what supports what these two gentlemen is saying is the fact that, after all, Turkey is a huge landmass between Russia and Syria. So if you want to take military equipment or troops across, you have to overfly Turkey. Now, the same media reports, which have said that more equipment is going, have said that Russia has taken overflight permissions from Turkey. And Turkey has given those permissions. Now, Turkey and Russia are on two opposing sides in the Syrian conflict. Why would the Turkish government give permission for overflight for troops and equipment which would escalate the conflict there? So it doesn't make any sense, does it?
Well, you see, the Turkish role in the Syrian crisis is very, for sure, you have said it, and I'm happy to hear from both the distinguished guests of yours speaking on the same time, because the infrastructures of the terrorism has already built up on the 950 kilometers. That is because they are supporting Daesh. I wanted to draw the line here. Are we fighting IS or no? Is the war in Syria is against the Syrian government? Is it a regime change policy? Then we fall in the hand of the American and the West that they wanted a regime change in the Arab world? Or are we fighting IS?
We will discuss that in a minute. But my question to you was, Turkey would not have given permission for overflights in the first place if they thought lethal weapons for intensifying the war.
No, but Russia have used the space of Iran because Greece and Bulgaria have blocked it as per the American instruction to them. Turkey has given the space for the humanitarian aid. They know that heavy weapon can come through the warships to Russia. They do not need the space to arm shifting. And besides, Syrian government have a long relation with the Russian, and all our equipment is based from the Russian industry. So therefore, this type of deal, which was already contract with the Russian, has been signed prior to the crisis in Syria.
Okay. Sibal, Russia has not categorically ruled out putting boots on the ground, because when President Vladimir Putin was asked about it, he said, we are looking at various options. Does this mean that because the situation is dynamic, Russia cannot be expected to rule out sending in combat troops in advance? Or is it just merely a threat saying that these options are open?
I would be more surprised if Russia put boots on the ground. In fact, I don't think they will do that. Why should they intervene physically in this extremely dangerous and volatile situation? As it is, they have found it very difficult to deal with the West over the Ukraine issue, and then they go further afield and then get into the quagmire of Syria in that manner. I don't believe it at all. But yes, in terms of training, how to use the equipment, some additional people to tell the Syrians how to use the latest equipment they're selling. But coming back to what you said earlier, you said one time there were reports that Russia may sell advanced anti-aircraft systems like S-300 or whatever, but nothing of the kind. So if they are upgrading the present systems in order to protect Damascus and the territory that is being held by the Syrian government, in the face of what is being asked for is a kind of a no-fly zone, and the fact that US and Britain and others are actually bombing Syrian territory without the permission of the Syrian government, all that actually means that Russia has to be extremely careful about what the West may or may not do in terms of toppling Assad.
Okay, all right. We need to take a break at this point. We'll be back again in a bit. Stay with us. Don't go away. Welcome back. We are discussing the increased Soviet military involvement in Syria. Dr. Awwad, you wanted to say something, add to what Sibal was saying.
Yes, I was saying that the Russian relation with Syria is a very long time. And the American involvement in the Syrian quagmire is already known for the rest of the world. That NATO involvement in Turkey as well. Yeah. So when you are starting a bombing and 6,700 sorties on IS in Syria for the last 1 year, of course you killed more civilians than you killed the IS terrorists. But at the same time, there is already a talk between intelligence of the Syrian government and the CIA on how to go inside Syria and attack. They cannot go without the collaboration of the Syrians.
So they're taking permission of the Syrian government.
They are taking the permission, even the West taking the permission, even Turkey taking the permission. They cannot say we cannot do it with the Syrian. They know the Syrian airspace is strong enough to tackle any kind of invaders or any foreign airplane getting into the Syrian space. Despite the fact that they have tried to damage and help the terrorists in capturing most of the army's places, but we have enough weapon to protect our territories.
Okay. Professor Ramakrishnan, what are Russia's foreign policy objectives in Syria in particular and West Asia in general? And how crucial is Syria for their regional foreign policy objectives?
Syria has been a very significant country, particularly from, after 1956, the Suez crisis, etc. And there is a very strong relationship between Russia and Syria, which was, when Hafiz al-Assad came to power, his first visit to a foreign country was to Russia in 1971.
Yes. Yeah.
Then you had the Friendship and Cooperation Treaty in 1980. You had all the military agreements and other things. So it has been a very close relationship. And Russia's professed policy with respect to the Bashar al-Assad regime is that it will not allow regime change in Syria.
So would you say that the proximate aim of Russian actions, as they're being reported now, is to protect the Assad regime?
Right,
primarily.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And their military base as well.
And it has also a linkage with what's going on in the region with NATO and what's going on in Europe.
Yeah.
Sibal, Russian military aid to Syria predates the rise of the Islamic State or the rise of this Al-Qaeda-linked Jabhat al-Nusra front. How credible then is President Putin's claim, or even Foreign Minister Lavrov's claim, that the Russian aid to Syria is part of an effort to fight extremism and terrorism? No. If earlier commitments are the only commitments being honored, they were pre-IS, pre-Jabhat al-Nusra.
No, I don't think that Russia's case on Syria is limited to helping Syria fight the Islamic extremists. I think there is a bigger issue behind this. And the biggest issue, of course, is that who has the say in changing the map of West Asia? Can the United Nations, can the US and Europe do as they please? Or is there international law? Is the United Nations system? Is there the UN Security Council? Do other big powers have a say in the matter? Does Russia matter? Does China matter? Number one. Number two is the question of peace and stability in a very volatile area. And then the whole question of humanitarian sufferance, whole societies are being destroyed, millions are being made refugees. Does anybody have a responsibility to place some checks on the policies of regime change of the Western powers? So Russia has a role, along with other countries in the world, in preventing such disasters from taking place. Number three, of course, is that why can't Russia sell arms or boost the Assad regime if the US and others can sell arms to the GCC countries and do as they please in terms of boosting their relations with countries which are their allies? So why can't Russia have an ally if the others can have an ally in the region? I mean, why these double standards? And finally, after the experience of Iraq and Libya, the West got away with it, Russia simply wants to prevent another regime change in Syria, because the repercussions of that on Russia itself sooner or later, in terms of putting the noose around Russia, which seems to be the direction in which Western policy is headed.
Dr. Awwad, if, I'm not saying this would happen, there's a big if the Assad regime were to fall, who would gain most? The Syrian opposition or the Islamic State? Who would end up controlling Syria? What would map of Syria look like then?
Well, let me tell you something. Since you're talking of the map of Syria, I'm glad you brought the map of Syria. I'll show you a map of Syria which was prior to the Ottoman and the French occupation of Syria. And that is the actual map of Syria. This is the map. I don't know if the map in yours can show, but if your camera can focus, this is the map of Syria which was prior to the Ottoman Empire occupation of Syria. And then they have taken the whole northern part of Syria, including the Syrian Iskenderun province, given by the French occupation in 1937 to the Turkish.
This is
so
the past.
aim.
This is the past.
No, that is the aim. If we do not know the past and intention of this, their objective, then we are nowhere. Why I'm asking you this question? Why they are supporting the Iraqi government, fighting IS with all the logistics, with the F-16, with the bombers, with all the American, and they're not fighting IS in Syria? This is the question has to be asked. It's not that the regime. The regime, it is the people of Syria have to decide.
But they are bombing IS.
Tell me how many they killed of IS.
I don't know how many
No.
they've killed, but I'm saying that all the NATO sorties are over territory controlled by IS.
But they are already recruiting 10,000 people. You kill 100, they're recruiting 1,000 people. So how they are recruiting? How they are not seeing all these convoys with 400, 500 convoys?
You're asking for cooperation, US and NATO cooperation with the Assad regime.
Nobody can fight IS. Actually who is fighting IS is the Kurdish forces, PKK, the Syrian army and the Iraqi army. The rest of the people are just an eyewash. There is nobody is fighting. You wanted to tell me that the Americans are seriously wanted to end the Daesh. Nobody wants to end the war in Syria. Everybody is benefiting. So a regime of Syria is decided by the people of Syria, and that's what we said from the beginning of the crisis. A political solution. There is no question of an army or supporting them by arm. Libya was created to give an arm industry and a culture of jihadists who came to Syria. All these issues one has to address it. It's not that the Russian is already, as he said, it's containment of Russia is part of the global game of NATO, arming of NATO and US against Russia and China. Because what happened in Crimea is the same thing happening in Syria. It's the only place where there is a foothold in the Mediterranean Sea for Russia. So Russia understands the game plan, and reshaping of the Middle East cannot be done by these forces.
Professor Ramakrishnan, if Assad were to fall, who stands to gain? The reason I'm asking this question is that at each point of time, you must decide on who your primary enemy is. Is the primary enemy of the civilized world the Islamic State? Is it President Bashar al-Assad? Or is it in the interest of the world to support those who are opposing, non-IS Syrian opposition?
They're supporting Al-Qaeda.
Is there a civilized world out there? Actually, the Americans started with the idea of regime change, like in Libya. And the Russians felt, as Ambassador Sibal was mentioning, the Russians felt cheated how that UN resolution was manipulated. And you see that the Americans, after the rise of the ISIS and so on, had to hold back on this quest for regime change. And therefore, that has not been the primary agenda after that, because after Bashar al-Assad, that question that you have asked is in everybody's mind, and there is no credible political entity that can replace Assad now. Okay. And therefore, and the Russians are fully committed with the Ba'athist regime. So in such a situation, one is not thinking about post-Bashar al-Assad regime in Syria, but there can be a role for Russia and maybe for Iran and others for political transition within Syria. Okay. If something can be worked out. All right. And Russia wants a major role in that.
We're going to discuss that in a bit. We've run out of time on this segment. We'll be back with you in a bit. Stay with us. Welcome back. We're discussing reports of increased Russian military involvement in Syria. Ambassador Sibal, in what way would expanded Russian military involvement in Syria or continued replenishment of arms and ammunition and whatever else is required by Syria complicate US and NATO aims in that country?
Well, I'll put it this way, that if tomorrow the US, NATO and Europe wanted to act recklessly and destroy the Assad regime, they can do it. And Russia would not be able to stop it. And Russia is not going to enter into a war with the West over this. And if the Americans have stayed their hand, if NATO has stayed their hand, because if they also find that they have no solution to the problem because of the emergence of certain forces which have become a huge problem, and especially the killing of Christians and the beheading of hostages, which has now galvanized public opinion, etc., etc. So I don't think that Russia is going to overextend itself to the point of actually willing to risk an actual conflict with the West over this. Okay. So every side has to behave responsibly, and I would again say that in this instant case, the West has acted irresponsibly and Russia has acted responsibly.
Okay. Now, Professor, do you think that therefore Moscow has twin aims? One is to protect the Assad regime, but at the same time, by backing the Assad regime, increase its bargaining power in any possible negotiation on transition of power or future of Syria?
Right, absolutely right. the one thing is absolutely clear that Syria is in shambles. The crisis is, creating such a big issue everywhere, the whole refugee issue in Europe and so on. So there is some kind of immediacy to the matter again because of the crisis in Europe, because of Syria. But no one is taking responsibility for this, and no one is coming forward to act. So the increased presence of Russia that you see now is one way of pointing towards the world that there's some power which is interested in showing to the world that this is an important issue and we are here. So even though it's a continuation of the policy, but there is an increased activity there, even though it's on the military side. But that may be a pointer towards telling the world that politically the Syrian issue has to be resolved so that the IS and other kinds of issues could be addressed properly.
Dr. Awwad, one such pointer came from the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov, who said that not involving the Syrian military in a US-led coalition to fight the Islamic State was a colossal mistake. Now, so do you see Syria, Russia, US, NATO, even if temporarily, coming together to fight the Islamic terrorists first and then talk about transition?
Well, that is what is the plan now. Actually, the Russian initiative is that to keep President Assad till his term is finished, and then they can decide the next future president of the country. That's one of the scenario they have played. But the other scenario also, which is very important for the West to understand, that keeping and supporting the IS, or the United States speaking now of supporting Al-Nusra, which is Al-Qaeda affiliated group like they have done with Bilhaj in Libya, and then they said they wanted to fight the IS. You are simply interfighting among and the total destruction of Syria. The Russian worries is very, very legitimate here. It's not only that they are wanted to support the regime or support the military base. The Russian concern that the Syrian exodus of Syria is being filled by the Chechen, filled by the Caucasus, filled by the extremists who are going to take on Russia again. So Russia is giving a warning even to the Saudis and the Qataris, who are paying each bullet fired by the NATO on Syria is paid by them. So therefore, they are telling them that you cannot take us for granted. By November, December, you have to finish everything. So the Russians are very adamant about finishing this because they know the next target is Russia and Iran. So therefore, it has to be looked at the crisis from a wider perspective.
Okay, so let me just ask you the last question. He talked of how the whole situation may react back on Russia. So do you see, if things continue like this, Russian involvement in Syria continues, US involvement also continues, could Russia domestically become more vulnerable to jihadist attacks and terrorist attacks?
Well, they've had this problem. It has been contained, but it has not been fully contained.
Could it start again? After
it's a bit like what's happening in Xinjiang. The Uyghur terrorists are there. They commit these terrorist acts, but overall China is maintaining control. Similarly, it's the case with Russia. Whether this can grow into something very big and start destabilizing the Russian society as a whole, I don't think so. I think that Russia has a good control over the situation, and they're very aware of what the challenge and the problem is. And I don't think that all the forces that are involved, including Gulf countries, NATO, US, and Europe, would be so reckless as to confront Russia with this kind of a position, because the world has to be managed at the end of the day. And more the United States and NATO and others realizing they can't handle the world on their own. They need cooperation of countries like Russia, China, and others. So I think at the end of the day, hopefully, this is a hope that better sense will prevail, and they'll deal with Russia as an equal partner and try together to solve these problems.
Okay. So on that hopeful note, we have to end this discussion. I'd like to thank you, Dr. Weil Awwad, Professor A.K. Ramakrishnan, Ambassador Kanwal Sibal, for participating in this discussion. That's all we have for you today. We'll be back again next week as usual. Till then, goodbye, and thanks for watching India's World.